Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to What You Need to Know About the Tax Fight. Lessons from last time and how taxing CEO pay and stock buybacks are some of the ultimate pro-worker tax policies. I'm Porter McConnell and I run the Take on Wall Street Coalition, and I'm going to be moderating today. You should know this briefing is part of a What to Know About the Tax Fight series that we're doing. And I just want to flag that our next briefing will be on the carried interest loophole, which is getting some renewed attention right now. But on to today, we have a great group here to engage with you in conversation. I'm excited to introduce them. First, a little bit of housekeeping, because we're trying to keep this an informal learning hour. We deliberately chose for this to be a meeting and not a webinar so we could interact with you. We welcome your tough questions. We just ask that the comments in the chat stay constructive and on topic, and we won't hesitate to bring the hammer down and remove any disrespectful commenters so that everybody else can learn. We're going to take questions in the chat as we go, so feel free to just type them as they come to you. The briefing is going to be recorded for those of you who couldn't make it. So just to flag though, we're going to remove the Q&A section from the video before we share it out. So this is a safe space. You can ask questions and feel confident that they won't be on the internet. And if you want to just ask anonymously, you can type your question to me as a direct message. Okay, on to the fun part. We have some great perspectives on this call today. I'm really excited. And we're going to hear from John Foti from Americans for Tax Fairness, Sarah Anderson at the Institute for Policy Studies, Natalia Renta of Americans for Financial Reform, Elena Lopez of the Communication Workers of America, Keir Quadras of CWA and formerly Wells Fargo. And we're also lucky to have on the call Richard Phillips from Senator Sanders' office and Dan Smith-Rubas from Senator Whitehouse's office, both of whom are leading the charge on legislation to tax CEO pay. Okay, but let's get ourselves oriented first. I'm going to turn it over to Foti to do that excellent work.
Thanks so much, Porter, and appreciate everyone, especially our friends from the Hill, who have taken time out of a very busy congressional recess to have this important conversation today. So I want to start off a little bit of an overview. As folks know, congressional Republicans are making a run at renewing aspects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that are expiring at the end of the year. And what you should most importantly know is that in 2017, Republicans made the majority of the corporate tax cuts in that bill permanent while making the individual side temporary in order to help save costs over the 10-year window. But today we're going to focus a little bit on the corporate tax rate reduction that was included in the 2017 law and what that has meant for the economy, for taxes since that corporate tax rate was permanently enacted 8 years ago. So the 2017 Trump tax scam slashed the corporate rate from 35 to 21%, the lowest top rate for corporations in 80 years, and a lower marginal rate than a worker who is making $45,000 a year. This corporate rate cut was by far the most single expensive part of the tax law, costing at the time $1.3 trillion in lost revenue over 10 years. And as we said, while most of the tax law is scheduled to expire at the end of 2025 on the individual side, the corporate rate cut was made permanent. And just to say, corporations are extremely profitable and were already making record profits prior to the 2017 law and did not need this tax cut in 2017. Corporations have actually been paying less and less in taxes as a share of total federal revenue and as a share of the economy. To give you a reference point, in the 1950s, corporate tax revenue accounted for nearly a third of total federal revenue. But by 2023, after the enactment of the Trump tax law, that share had dropped to just 9%. And as a share of the economy, GDP, corporate taxes have declined by as much as 3/4 from a height of 4% in 1967 to as little as 1% under the Trump tax law. And even worse, the corporate tax cut is not trickling down to workers as promised. After slashing the corporate rate by 14 percentage points, Republicans had promised that companies would boost wages and jobs. The Council of Economic Advisors at the time had said that workers would see, on average, $4,000 a year back from the 2017 tax law, and even further revised that miscalculation up from 4,000 to 9,000. But that never materialized, and we know many families actually saw even modest tax increases. But what happened on the corporate side was that corporations used the money that they got from the tax cuts to go on a massive stock buyback spending spree, giving their executives huge bonuses and keeping worker wages flat. One thing to note is that ATF did a study and a report that found that 35 companies post the 2017 tax law paid their executives more, their top 5 executives, more than they paid in federal taxes. And again, all of this is a consequence of the 2017 tax law that prioritized corporations over workers. And in the first 5 years of the Trump tax law, from 2018 to 2022, at least 87 of the most profitable corporations earned profits of 950 billion, nearly $1 trillion, and paid an effective tax rate below 10%, less than half of the 21% statutory rate. Of those 87 corporations, 23 paid less than zero, and they got tax refunds totaling nearly $4 billion. The Government Accountability Office discovered that large profitable corporations saw their average effective tax rate drop from 16% in 2014 to just 9% in 2018, with a quarter of them paying no taxes at all. And the Joint Committee on Taxation found that U.S. multinational corporations have been paying an effective tax rate of just 7.8% in 2018, a fall of more than half of what it was in 2017, and directly related to provisions in the 2017 tax law that incentivized corporations to move profits overseas and pay less in taxes. And one important point I want to get across is not only is raising taxes on corporations good policy, it is very widely popular among voters as well. A poll conducted by Data for Progress found that 57% of likely voters agree that taxes should be increased on large corporations, including 61% of independents. And another poll conducted by Navigator found that 65% of voters supported the previous administration's budget proposal, increasing the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%, including 68% of independents and nearly half of all Republicans. So just to say, this corporate tax cut has been extremely costly. It has not helped workers, and we need to look at new policies in order to help raise revenue from corporations that are making record profits and make sure that that money is reinvested back into workers and creating a more worker-centric economy. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Sarah Anderson to talk a little bit about some legislation that would accomplish just that. So Sarah, over to you.
Great, thank you, Fody. So this tax debate is mostly about how we can raise enough revenue fairly to pay for public services and infrastructure we need for a healthy economy. On this call, we're going to talk about a few bills that I like to think of as twofers, in that they would raise revenue, but they have the added bonus of discouraging harmful corporate practices. And this is not a new idea to use taxes to influence behavior. Tobacco taxes, for example, have reduced smoking rates and public health costs while generating revenue for public health programs. Many countries use carbon taxes to reduce harmful emissions. And like climate change and smoking, excessive CEO pay also threatens our public welfare. We have all seen how CEOs chasing huge bonuses have violated labor rights and put workers' lives at risk, flooded communities with opioids, crashed our financial system, made our food safety in jeopardy, and so forth. And right now, we're seeing how CEOs who've amassed truly obscene amounts of wealth are corrupting our democracy. Many of you will remember when a judge blocked Elon Musk's $55 billion pay package, and then the corporate board insisted, though, that they absolutely had to pay Elon that much Otherwise, he would get distracted from his duties as the CEO of Tesla. And, they should be so embarrassed about that now, but they're not, because our CEO pay system is so out of control, and corporate boards routinely do whatever it takes to protect the CEO's huge paycheck, no matter, how badly he's performing or how distracted he is, no matter how dangerous his decisions might be for workers and the economy. And so I'm going to tell you about two bills that address the problem of excessive CEO pay. And then Natalia will speak about one on stock buybacks, which is all part of the same problem, because stock buybacks inflate CEO stock-based pay and just help perpetuate this whole pay for non-performance system. So both of the bills I'm going to talk about would increase taxes on corporations with huge gaps between their CEO and median worker pay. And the objective is to create an incentive to rein in executive pay and raise worker wages while generating significant revenue. And the first one is the Curtailing Executive Overcompensation Act, which turns into the very clever CEO Act as an acronym. And that would apply a 1% excise tax on companies with large pay disparities. And how the formula would work out is that companies with a pay gap of more than 50-1 or more would owe extra taxes. And if they also have extremely high CEO pay, they would owe even more. And this bill, if it had been in effect in 2022, would have raised an estimated $10 billion or more just from the top 100 US companies. Senator Whitehouse has been the champion on this bill, and we're lucky to have his senior tax advisor, Dan Smith Ribas, here to answer any questions during the Q&A portion at the end of the call. But Dan, I wonder if you would be willing to go off mute and just briefly introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, yeah, Dan Rubos with Senator Whitehouse. Really glad folks could make it today, and yeah, happy to answer any questions about the bill, which I think we'll probably be reintroducing sometime around April after the latest data comes in on CEO pay.
Great, thank you. So the second bill is the Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act. It's just slightly different in design. Instead of an excise tax, it would tie a company's federal corporate tax rate to the size of its pay gap. So penalties would kick in for companies that pay their top executives between 50 and 100 times more than their median workers. And the highest penalty would apply to companies that pay their top executives over 500 times their worker pay. And believe it or not, there are a lot of companies that do pay more than 500 times that. And the revenue estimate for that one is $150 billion over 10 years. And Senator Bernie Sanders has been the lead champion of that bill. And we're lucky to have Richard Phillips from that team here to answer any questions about it. And I wonder if, Richard, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Richard Phillips. I'm the Pensions and Tax Policy Director for Senator Sanders, and happy to chat with anyone interested in the bill.
Great. I'll just end by pointing out that, like Fody cited these opinion polls, these kinds of taxes on huge CEO to worker pay gaps are also enormously popular across the political spectrum. One survey last year found that 89% of Democrats, 77% of independents, and 71% of Republicans support the idea. And so Americans are fed up with overpaid CEOs, and they really want Congress to do something about it. So I hope you'll support these bills. And now I'm going to pass it over to Natalia Renta, the stock buybacks maven over at Americans for Financial Reform.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'm going to talk about the stock buybacks excise tax, but before doing that, I want to take a step back and talk about what stock buybacks are and why they're bad for our economy and why they're bad for workers and benefit Wall Street and CEOs. So what are stock buybacks? When a company purchases its own shares, resulting in fewer outstanding shares, which artificially boost share price. So for example, if a company has 100 outstanding shares and you own one of them, right? You own 1/100th of the company's equity. But if the company goes out and buys back 10 of those shares, all of a sudden you own 1/90th of the company. So just kind of by magic, you own more of the equity in the company. So you may be wondering, how is that legal? So before 1982, it was mostly not, because companies had to be worried about being held liable for market manipulation if they engaged in stock buybacks. So they actually spent very little on stock buybacks. But in 1982, the Securities and Exchange Commission changed the rules, and they created a very large safe harbor, saying that if companies stayed within certain parameters when they engaged in stock buybacks, they didn't have to worry about getting sued. So how prevalent are stock buybacks? In short, they're very prevalent. And I think one thing to really keep in mind during this tax fight is that, as Foti said, in the debate leading up to the passage of the 2017 tax cuts, large corporations promised, if you lower our tax rate, we'll increase worker wages, it will be good for workers. And instead, they went on a stock buyback spending spree, and the S&P 500 firms alone spent $806 billion on stock buybacks on the first year after the tax cuts, which was a massive jump from the $519 billion they spent in 2017. And spending on stock buybacks has continued to be extremely rampant, and analysts forecast that this year it'll exceed $1 trillion. And that great ATF report that Foti mentioned also has great data on how a lot of companies spend significantly more on stock buybacks than paying federal taxes. So 85% spent more on stock buybacks alone than they paid in taxes out of the 280 profitable corporations that they looked at, and they spent almost 4.5 times more in stock buybacks than they did in paying taxes. And something to keep in mind is that stock buybacks exacerbate racial and wealth inequality. So according to the Federal Reserve, less than 1% of corporate equities and mutual fund shares are owned by Black people and Latinx people respectively, and almost 87% are owned by white individuals. And meanwhile, the top 10% owned over 87%. So every time you inflate the value of public shares, you're exacerbating racial and wealth inequality. So in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, the first ever excise tax was passed. It's 1% excise tax on stock buybacks. And last Congress, Senators Brown and Wyden introduced the Stock Buyback Accountability Act, which would increase that tax from 1% to 4%. And Jonathan Goldman, who's the senior tax counsel for the Democratic staff of the Senate Finance Committee, couldn't be here today, but he is available for folks interested in talking to him about getting involved in this tax. So I think, the two pieces to remember are, increasing this historic 1% tax to 4%, or higher percentages, and also to be wary of all of these arguments, right, that corporations make that these tax cuts ultimately benefit workers because they'll have more money to pay workers, when we know that a lot of this money is getting funneled into stock buybacks. So I will pass it now to Elena Lopez from the Communications Workers of America, who will talk about how both of these issues come up at the bargaining table.
Thanks, Natalia. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm glad that you guys could take some time out of your day to really listen to why this legislation is so important and these issues are so important to us. My name is Elena Lopez. I'm Deputy Legislative Director at the Communication Workers of America, CWA, and really going to talk about how stock buybacks and excessive CEO pay have real consequences for working families and the health of our economy. So over the past decade, as you've heard from all these previous speakers, corporations have funneled huge amounts of profits into stock buybacks and CEO pay instead of investing in the workers, right, who are really the backbone of their companies. Before the recent stock buyback explosions, companies used to use their profits to raise wages, improve benefits, invest in new equipment, and create new jobs. Now, what we're seeing, it's all about boosting shareholder value, right, at the expense of long-term growth and stability. We at our union see it all the time. I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, at the end of the last year, we saw AT&T abandon rural customers by discontinuing their copper service, leaving many of them with only wireless and satellite as options, which all might sound great, but it doesn't really help those rural customers. The same day they announced this, they revealed plans to spend $40 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. So wealthy investors benefit. Those people at the top do, while our rural communities and people who work at AT&T get the short end of the stick. At GE Aerospace, executives are pushing for $15 billion in stock buybacks. And as we go into contract negotiations, our members are worried that the buybacks will ultimately undermine their bargaining power and the workforce. Instead of buybacks, there are a number of things that GE could do, like invest in American manufacturing, invest in our highly skilled workforce, and invest in research and engineering. Even in sectors like the semiconductor industry, companies like Intel are prioritizing buybacks over fair wages for their workforce, even as they receive so much money in taxpayer subsidies from the CHIPS Act. And you'll hear more about Wells Fargo in a bit, but one last example. Wells Fargo spent nearly $74 billion on stock buybacks between 2019 and 2023. If an excise tax of 4% had been in effect during this period, the bank would have owed more than $2.9 billion more in taxes. Or they could have avoided paying these taxes and used those profits to instead invest in improving worker pay and customer services. So the bottom line is clear, right? Buybacks enrich a select few at the top while harming everyone else. They drain resources from investment in workers, innovation, and long-term growth. They erode job security, depress wages, and exacerbate income inequality. Workers deserve better. And while Congress is evaluating a whole host of options to raise revenues, a tax on CEO pay and stock buyback should be a part of that policy solution. CWA is proud to support all the legislation that we discussed, as they tackle corporate greed and begin to reverse racial and wealth inequality. So we need these policies that incentivize companies to invest in their workers and their futures, not just line their pockets. And again, right, they raise revenue. And I think that's really important as we talk about going into this tax fight. So thank you so much for your time. Look forward to any questions, and I will turn it over to Kier, who can give us a prime example of how this, is effect on the ground.
Thank you so much, Elena, and thank you everyone for being part of this webinar. I want to thank you also for allowing me the opportunity to share my story. My name is Karen Quadras, and I worked at Wells Fargo before I was laid off last October for unionizing. I started my career at Wells Fargo over 22 years ago, first as a teller, then as a banker, and then later as an investigator in the department that handles misconduct allegations. I was also a branch manager during that time at several branches across Arizona and California. Our department, it would handle all of the misconduct allegations when I was an investigator from both employees and also from our customers. So we were the gatekeepers and saw every single complaint against the company. It would come into my department directly. Many of you probably know about the big scandal at Wells Fargo when extreme pressure to meet sales quotas led employees to create millions of fraudulent accounts without clients' consent. And I personally experienced the relentless sales pressure that has defined Wells Fargo's culture for decades. Since that scandal blew up in 2016, Wells Fargo has had to pay billions of dollars in fees. And the Fed also imposed an asset cap that is supposed to be in place until the problems that led to the scandal are fixed. Right now, our CEO, Charlie Scharf, is trying to convince regulators that it's time to lift that asset cap. But employees have seen how he is still cutting corners in many ways that are putting our customers at risk. Last year, our department decided to unionize for two major reasons. First, as a response to a plan to outsource our jobs to India, we were concerned not only about losing our jobs, but also how this might jeopardize sensitive military information for not only our clients, but also for our employees that are in the military. Second, we believed a union would help us speak up and fight the kind of practices that led to that scandal. Wells Fargo's risk and complaint departments, for example, have been gutted. They used shortcuts to create the illusion of fewer complaints, but in reality, they're closing many prematurely. They're closing many of the cases prematurely rather than properly investigating the cases. Managers are now pressing workers on meeting sales outcomes, which is just code for sales quotas. And believe it or not, we are still seeing complaints about unauthorized accounts over a decade later. CEO Charlie Scharf and other executives clearly see unions as a threat to their primary goal of maximizing short-term profits for their own interest. They're slashing thousands of US jobs and funneling the money saved from slashing those jobs to the top executives. In 2024, Scharf received a staggering $31.2 million compensation package. That was a 7% increase from the previous year at a time when us as employees are lucky to see a 2 to 3% raise. And sometimes there are employees such as myself that didn't receive a raise for over 4 years. Between 2019 and 2023, Wells Fargo also spent over $73 billion on stock buybacks, money that could have gone towards workers' pay or even on improving some of our services. The legislation we've been discussing today would push companies like Wells Fargo to focus more on long-term prosperity and stability rather than simply making wealthy executives and shareholders even richer. In the meantime, Wells Fargo employees will continue to fight to form one big union so we can make the bank better for the rest of all of us as employees, the workers, and also the customers and the communities that we serve. Thank you again for the time that you guys took today to spend on this, to talk with us today. And I look forward to any questions that you might have. And with that, I'll pass it back to Porter.
Thanks, Kier. Unbelievable. Well, I guess believable in these times. Okay, I have a few questions that I'm curious to get answers for. I also want to encourage you to put your questions in the chat. Remember, they will not show up on the internet. It's a safe space, and direct message me if you'd